Okay, let's start at the beginning.
All
How
right.
did you get into philosophy in the first place?
I think I was always interested in philosophy, and the reason I think this is because I actually just a while ago, cleaning out some boxes, found a Socratic dialogue that I wrote in first grade, although it wasn't very Socratic and I didn't know what I was doing. But I majored in philosophy in college, and the way I chose that major was sort of twofold. The first was I couldn't decide between a lot of things that I wanted to study. And it felt to me like philosophy was a discipline where I could study all of them or move between them, which has turned out to be in some ways true and in some ways not. But pretty much it worked out that way. And the other thing was I was considering an English major, and I had a quarter in which in English I had to read like 10 Dickens novels that were this thick in my English class. And then I read the Meditations, which is this thick, in my philosophy class. And it turned out that I read much better this way than this way. And so I realized that what I was interested in literature was mostly the kind of thematic stuff that I could get at more directly in philosophy. And that sort of put me over the edge, and I never looked back.
Yeah, I think that must be a common experience because you have to like reading, but then an awful lot of English is, the plosiveness of the P indicates and it's like, where are you getting this stuff? This is just
Right? It's like, can we get to the good stuff?
right,
Yeah,
the
well, what's it
arguments.
about? So, also, I'm just a slow reader,
No,
actually.
I'm the same way. It's funny. Everybody else in my family can read so much faster, but they skim, and I just, how can you do that? How can you miss chunks? You can't miss stuff. You
I
gotta,
don't know.
yeah. So maybe that's it. Maybe philosophers are just slow readers.
Well, there has to be some of us,
That's
so.
right. Where slow and solid wins the race.
Exactly.
So, what was your dissertation on?
My dissertation was on personal identity, the topic I am still working on. And I sort of got to my discussion. There you go. Actually, my dissertation had the same title as my first book. Oh, no, yeah, it did. It did. And I got to the topic in pretty much the same way I got to philosophy by just one day realizing that's what I was interested in. And in this case, it got to the point in graduate school where everybody else had chosen a topic but me in my class, and I was getting frantic. So I took a weekend and said, okay, I'm going to figure out what I'm going to write on. And I looked over all the papers I had written for coursework, and they were all on personal identity, no matter what the class was. So I decided, okay. And that's what I started working on. And it turns out to have been complicated enough and hard enough that I'm still working on it decades later.
Yeah, there was a time there when it seemed to have hit a bit of a dead end. At least I thought so,
Hmm.
post Parfit. But certainly this animalism has opened up a whole new.
Yes.
And of course, there's problems with Parfit. So, what do you think drew you to the topic in the first place? I mean, when was your first encounter with the issue? Was it just something you'd always wrestled with, or was it a particular moment when you encountered this issue and it spoke to you?
Well, I think it was something I had always wrestled with in one form or another. And I think it's a thing, one of the things that's great about the topic is it's a question that a lot of people wrestle with and wrestle with in a lot of really different ways. I mean, that's one of the things that's so interesting but also so frustrating about the topic is you can be talking about completely different things. Most people think when you're talking about personal identity that you mean something like your social identity or the identity of identity politics or your most firmly held beliefs and so on. But in philosophy, right, as you know, there's this question of just basic, is that entity the same entity in the future as the one that's sitting here talking to you now? But I think, I don't know, I worried a lot about mortality when I was young. And I think that the personal identity question, ties so directly, especially in its origins, into that question about, what does it mean for me to survive? What kinds of changes could I survive, right? What does it mean for me to be there in the future? What do I really care about anyway? So I was always interested in those questions. And then I had a really good class on Locke that had a really good discussion of Locke on personal identity, and I found that very congenial and interesting. And then as it just turned out, right place, right time, there was a whole lot going on in the philosophy of personal identity right around when I was in graduate school. And then Reasons and Persons came out just around then. And we had a reading group on Reasons and Persons. And so really the way I got launched on the dissertation was I was presenting on personal identity, the first chapters on personal identity and Reasons and Persons at our reading group in graduate school, which is a faculty student reading group. And I just read the stuff and I thought it was wacky. I said, this is clearly no one could believe this. And I said to someone I respected very much, clearly no one could believe this. And he said, I don't know, I think it's really important stuff. And I thought, oh, maybe I missed something. And I went back and I said, no, clearly no one could believe this. But then when I tried to articulate why, as so often happens in philosophy, this thing was completely wrong, it turned out to be a lot smarter and deeper than I thought. And so it took a lot of years to say, it no longer seems wacky to me, but I still disagree. But it seems to me like there's something very important going on there. But at the time, it was just this frustration with not being able to articulate what seemed to me so clearly wrong about it, plus the fact that people I trusted had a much different perception.
Right. I mean, that's like, there's a lot of puzzles in philosophy like that. Like people have that with Epicurus's argument that death cannot harm you. It's like preposterous, and then you
of course it harms you. Well, right, and it's the same. I found myself, thinking, well, am I in the position of the students I teach when I go in and tell them something that after years of careful study I believe is really problematic, and they just shrug their shoulders and say no, it isn't. So, yes.
I remember as an undergraduate, I think it was Jonathan Glover was giving this lecture, and the example, I don't know if he got it from somewhere, but the example that he used that has stuck with me, that was the one that pulled the rug out from underneath you just after you've been kind of sold on the continuity, the idea that if you remember being something, then you are that person. So would you use the Star Trek transporter? And everybody says yes. And then he tells the example of, well, you get in the transporter, you press the button, nothing appears to happen, but then you see on the view screen you getting out of the booth on the other end, and then it suddenly says, disintegration this end temporarily delayed will begin in 5, 4, and then suddenly it brings, wait a minute, it didn't work before. I've been dying every time. So I think it is a case where your intuitions can be certainly prodded and poked in different directions.
I'm still struggling with that particular case.
Right.
I still think that, to say what the difference is there is still really hard. And I think Parfit was the one who so clearly articulated why.
Yeah, and I think Parfit, it's valuable to have people who are prepared to just bite the bullet and go whole hog, and I'm committed to this view. And he says it so nicely as well. Like, what was his phrase about? I used to think I was in a glass tube or something. A
glass tunnel, and going
now,
toward my death.
And I like how he said, writes all this very dense analytic philosophy, and at the end he says, well, basically it's Buddhism, Essentially,
he has like a 2-sentence thing that says, Wittgenstein would have agreed, and so would Buddha.
Right.
Okay.
Oh, okay. You're going to pull rank, are you?
And therefore, he thinks it's true as he hopes for all people at all times.
Right. I'm not sure that follows. But now you said you started with, as so many people do, with a discussion, with Locke's discussion of personal identity. Now you have a slightly different take from the usual on Locke's contribution. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
A little bit about my first different take or my second different take?
Well, both would be good.
Both. Yeah, so I think Locke is at least the source. It's always hard to disentangle in your head the source where it started in philosophy and the source where it started for you.
Right.
But certainly for me, Locke is the place where the idea that personal identity, the fact of personal identity, the metaphysical fact of personal identity is tied to practical considerations is straightforwardly put forward as a constraint on a theory of personal identity. So basically, I see Locke as saying that, you know, what it is to be a person. He says person is a forensic term. He uses that phrase famously, and what he means by that roughly is that, you know, a person is someone you can hold responsible for his or her past actions. A person is someone who has a particular kind of rational concern for future well-being that's qualitatively different from concern for others, even if, you know, the concern for others can be greater. And that whatever relation we define personal identity in terms of ought to illuminate or at least support these practices concerning people. That is, whatever makes me the same as some future person should help explain why I'm responsible for my past actions and no one else's, or I have this special kind of concern. So that was how I understood Locke.
And of course, I'm sorry to interrupt, but for people who aren't familiar, the major one of the great things about the Locke discussion is it makes very short work of the two major candidates for personal identity. It says we're not our bodies and we're not our souls, and that's the part that a lot of people kind of skim over. But I love his little story about he meets this Christian Platonist who claims to have the soul of Socrates. And then he points out, but he doesn't have any memories of Socrates, so we just think he has Socrates' soul. We don't think he's Socrates, so therefore soul and person not the same. So that's what most people tend to get out of the Locke. They just get out of him dismissing these two alternatives and then coming up with this stream of this connectivity of consciousness view, or usually simply put, the memory view. If you remember being somebody,
right,
then you are that person. That's what most people get out. And then this stuff about the forensic term sort of comes later on in the discussion, and by that point, people have kind of thought, well, the important stuff has already happened. I mean, it's good because he's addressing questions like, is a man drunk the same as a man sober, and those things. And also the other thing about Locke is it's the first science fiction examples, or the first major science fiction examples in philosophy, in modern philosophy, like the Prince and the Cobbler, which
right.
I'm surprised the Wachowski siblings haven't done a Prince and a Cobbler, movie.
Well, the Prince and the Cobbler strangely involves the transfer of a soul, but Disney has done it in Freaky Friday.
There you go. Yeah.
There you go. But yes, no, it's true. But see, the way I read Locke, it is true. So I should have said that the first thing that people tend to take from Locke is that he gives us a relational view of personal identity, rather than personal identity consisting in the continuation of any substance, whether it be, right, your body or organism, as we later come to say, or your soul, even if there are such things as immaterial souls. Neither one of those is relevant, or neither one is necessary or sufficient for continuing. What you need, he says, is sameness of consciousness. The reason I bring up the forensic stuff, aside from the fact that I've been very interested in it, is as I read him, that is his justification for the sameness of consciousness view. He's saying, whatever it is, so he makes this distinction between person and man. And he says, you can ask the question of what makes you the same man or same human, or the question of what makes you the same person. Those are different concepts, and they'll have different criteria of identity. And a person, I think the fact that person is a forensic term in a very broad sense, because I mean, it's not only responsibility and prudential concern, but also this thing about mortality, this question of survival, and this question of whether, I am told by historians who work on Locke, whether you might have a sullied soul that did something bad in previous times, and so even though you live an exemplary life, you might be punished by eternal torment because you just don't know it. And he's saying, don't worry, if you don't remember it, it's not yours.
On the great day of judgment.
That day of judgment, on the day, God will know what you really remember and what you don't. So, so the relational view is the sort of metaphysical payoff, which I think he gets by linking the metaphysics to the practical.
Yeah, I mean, all of the intuition pumps, as Daniel Dennett says, that are used to push the relational view are things like, well, who should be punished, or who do you want to survive? Whenever you do this with, in a class, you would say, okay, which one of these do you care if they live or die, or which one of these should be punished for that crime? Should it be the person with the body, but the memory of the body of the innocent person, but the memory of the criminal, or vice versa? And they always go with the consciousness. So the intuition pumps always do refer to practical considerations like punishment and desert and so on.
So the way that I diverge from the standard reading of Locke in my first book, and still, is that, as you've been saying, most people, so Locke says it can't be sameness of body or soul, it has to be sameness of consciousness. Well, what's that, right? So you've got this problem of saying, well, what does it mean to say that he says, if I have the same consciousness that Noah had at the flood, that I'm Noah, well, what does it mean for me to have Noah's consciousness? And so usually that's read as memory. Locke does not actually ever say that it's memory.
No, and his view of memory is pretty weird as well. I seem to remember reading it once, and it sounded very ephemeral and untrustworthy.
Right. So I mean, for good reason, people have said, well, what can it mean for me to have consciousness of some past action? I'm only conscious of the present directly, so it must be to remember it. And so the idea is that most people say, well, what Locke is really saying is if you remember the actions of this person, then you're the person. Otherwise, you're not. And you can get that intuition going by saying, well, if you have total amnesia and you can never recover any memory of this life, then that future person, you might as well be dead, right? If you knew that was going to happen to you, you would write goodbye notes to the people you love and so on. And furthermore, you could, for the afterlife kind of question, saying, well, would you rather have your soul go on completely stripped of any of the memories of your current life, or if there's some other form of existence in which you remember everything that happened to you? That seems more like survival. So that works, but there are obviously a lot of problems with defining personal identity in terms of memory, which have been pointed out over the years, like we misremember things all the time, we forget things that it seems pretty clear that we did, and a host of other problems. And so what I argue is I don't think that Locke really means to say that sameness of consciousness is constituted by remembering, or at least by remembering alone, or always by remembering, although I think memory probably plays a huge role in it. But what he talks about is appropriation, and what he talks about is concern. And so he talks about being concerned in past actions, and he talks about appropriating them to myself. And when he talks about what's part of my consciousness in the present, it has to do with a kind of experiential or phenomenological component that has automatically to do with what I care about. So basically what he says is, one feature of consciousness is if you're conscious, you can't help but care about the quality of your consciousness. You want it to be nice instead of nasty. So this present body is part of my consciousness because I feel what happens to it and I therefore care about it. So if you put this hand in the heat, that's painful to me. My consciousness is affected by it, and that makes this my body now. So I take him to be saying that we extend our consciousness to the past by being concerned in what happened in the past. So obviously I don't directly feel now what happened to any past body in the sense that its aches and pains are mine. But I can in the sense that the quality of my present experience is determined by what happened to that past person in a very direct way. meaning that if I'm sitting here, right, fuming about that thing that somebody said to me in the faculty meeting, then it's that person who had that thing said to her in the faculty meeting who's affecting my current consciousness. So I see him as saying, roughly, because he thinks that personal identity has to do with responsibility and future-looking concern and so on, it's where that concern goes that extends consciousness. It's my appropriating past actions and experiences, or antecedently, appropriating provisionally future ones that makes them mine. So in a way, I constitute myself, hence the title Constitution, right? We constitute ourselves by, as I argue, thinking of ourselves as persisting beings. And his very first definition of person actually is a thinking, intelligent being that has reason and reflection and can consider itself as the same self in different times and places. So, I mean, he does say it's something about being aware of our persistence, which I think many people would accept is one of the defining features of creatures like us, that we, unlike other conscious creatures, have an awareness of the fact that we persist over time, that, we can look forward to our futures, we anticipate and remember in a certain way. And so the argument is that it's actually our appropriation of past, so there's no pre-existing past and future, well, it's a more complicated story than that, but that until we appropriate the past and future, they can't affect us in the ways that are characteristic of persons.
So, of course, the implication of this is that it's the practical implications really that are driving this, and the consciousness view is what results. So we shouldn't overcommit to the consciousness view and lose the practical considerations, because the practical considerations for Locke, on your view, is what led him to that view, not the other way around, not some kind of coincidence that he decided that we were what we remember, that there's this connection of consciousness, and then, and by the way, that happens to coincide with practical considerations.
Yeah, it depends on how precise you are about what practical considerations you're thinking of, because I do at least still agree with Locke that there's some conception of what we are that is connected to our being able to experience ourselves as continuing. And that in itself is a practical implication. This, survival is one of the things that people talk about, and our interest in survival and what would satisfy us, or as Parfit would put it, what matters in survival. And whether that's exactly the same practical consideration as moral responsibility and prudential concern is a different question.
So would you say that it's kind of essential, and maybe this is the basis of your dispute with the episodics that we can get into in a little bit, that that we extend, that there's something essential about taking up a fairly extended span of time, because that's what we care about, and in some sense that's essential for being a person, or for being the kind of being that we want to be.
Yes.
Okay, that was easy.
Right, in the sense that, yeah, I mean, I do think one of the places you can start getting into this discussion maybe, and one of the places that I find Locke most compelling, is that if you try to think of the contrast with beings that can have fairly sophisticated states of consciousness, but that don't, in one way or another, seem to have quite the sense of extension that we have.
You mean people like Galen Strawson?
No, not people like Galen Strawson, who has a perfectly good extended sense of self, but we'll get back to that later. People like we presume many of our, pets and other creatures to be, or people like these people with Korsakoff syndrome who cannot retain anything in short-term memory and seem to, fill their diaries in the famous BBC special, right, with now I am awake for the first time, now I am awake for the first time. People who can't get any, I mean, it seems to me that all of the things that we take to be sort of special about persons. So if the idea is that you distinguish personal identity as locked in from vegetable identity, right? And so I'm having a subtitle, vegetable identity.
I know, that always makes me laugh.
Right, so, but I mean, and so the identity of living things is one thing, he says, right? For a living thing, there are biological conditions, basically, of identity. And if you think that the identity of yourself, right, is anything beyond that, if you think that there's something more there that you're concerned about, that you would have continue even if the body didn't, or that if the body continued and it didn't, you would feel you were gone, right? That's the flip side of this. People who are in vegetative states or more or less controversially really in deep coma, and you just say, okay, the person's gone, the shell is still there. If you want to say what the person is, I think capturing that notion of what I would now call self rather than person, it has to be something that is able to experience itself, not just think of itself, but experience itself as persisting over time. So that's the longer answer to your question.
There's a question of terminology that maybe I should have introduced earlier, but maybe it would help with this. But could you just say something about the distinction between the re-identification and the characterization question? Because, a lot of what you've said presupposes that, but it's a helpful distinction that, you usually put at the beginnings of your discussions.
Yes. So, this was the sort of thing that I figured out in my dissertation, is that a lot of the complexity or crosstalk, yes, of the discussion had to do with the fact that these two different notions of identity were being used interchangeably. So one is the one that philosophers, they're both notions that philosophers like to talk about, but in different spheres of philosophy. So one is sort of the one metaphysicians take themselves frequently to be addressing, which is this thing that I mentioned earlier, is this brute fact of, is that one in the future the same thing, the same object as the one here? So this is just, you can think of as stemming from general identity problems like the ship of Theseus, right? You've got the wooden ship and you replace one plank and another and another. Over 20 years, there's no wood in common. Is it the same ship? If so, why? If so, why not? How quickly can you replace the planks, et cetera? You can generate a million puzzles there. And so the re-identification question is just that question for us, right? So there's some, Eric Olson does not like this formulation of the question. We'll come back to that, I think, later too. But traditionally, there's some person in the future, there's some person now. Is the one in the future the same as the one now? Are they identical to one another? Identity is a logical relation, right? It's reflexive, symmetric, transitive, all those things. It means, this equals that. So it's a question of numerical identity. Then a lot of what people talk about when they talk about personal identity is, what do I truly believe? What do I truly want? What traits do I actually possess? Is this action truly an action of mine or just something that happened through me? So in moral psychology and action theory, there's a lot of discussion of that sort, and there's a lot of work to make the distinction between, I impulsively reach for the thing without thinking about it. That's not something I did, but, I plan to grab it. That is something I did.
Well, and I think you can see something like this in the distinction between second-degree murder and first-degree murder, where we say it's much worse if it's premeditated and you obviously thought about it, and this obviously was something that came from the depths of you, whereas if you just got crazy and, and stabbed someone and then said, oh God, what have I done? It's not the same, because it's not reflective of the real you, and that therefore you're not, for one thing, you're not really as dangerous once this has got, maybe we should worry about your angry spells, but
yeah,
your basic character isn't that of an evil, scheming murderer.
Well, one of the things is something that someone said to me offhand once, I think at a job interview or something, which I've thought about a lot, is he said, that we make this distinction that way, but really, who are you more worried about?
Right.
The person who wanted to get his uncle out of the way so that he could get the inheritance and rationally and calmly did it, or the guy who, when he gets mad at you in a bar, stabs you to death. So, in some ways you might say it's more indicative, but that's a whole other set of questions of who you...
No, and it's certainly true that you think some murderers, once they've murdered that one person, that's it. They're not going to do it. And that person was a major source of torment in their life, and that's why they had to get them out of the way, but they're not going to go around. They don't care about
just
killing anybody else. Whereas, yes, the guy who stabs people in bars is dangerous. But maybe somebody who shouldn't necessarily be punished, but just should be medicated.
Right. So, but this is helpful, because really what's going on here is a dispute within what I call the characterization question, because, the person who said this to me, who said, why is first-degree murder worse than second-degree murder, really, when second-degree murder shows that you've got this tendency to fly off the handle and get violent, and first-degree murder only shows that when there's a good reason for you. It's not as simple as that, obviously, and I don't know the law well enough.
Right.
But his analysis was that there's this platonic sense of self that's being imported into law, where your reason is the true you and your animal parts are not the true you.
Right.
And he was saying, why shouldn't the animal parts be the true you? So that's a question. What's the true you? I don't know the answer to that question, and I haven't answered it. Certainly the predominant view is the former, something like the former, that what you endorse or reflect upon or have reason to do. But in any event, the question there is not a question of re-identification. It's not a question when we say, are you really the person who committed that murder because you were so outraged and drunk when you did it, that it's not typical for you. The question isn't a question of, are you numerically the same person who did the murder, because we know that you are in this case, by supposition. It wasn't you, but that guy. Right. But there is a question about whether it comes from you, whether it's an action that's truly attributable to you.
Well, and all of this kind of, the characterization question comes up, for example, in trans issues. Like, I know Caitlyn Jenner is in the news, but I remember one of the things that surprised me about George W. Bush is that a classmate of his who had transitioned from male to female came to a reunion party at the White House, and he was very gracious and said, congratulations on being the person you always were, or something like that. Mm-hmm. So that way of putting it suggests that, it's a characterization question, that now your body matches what you always thought it should. This is the real you. But there's no question that the person he went to school with is a different person in the
Right.
re-identification issue from the person who visited the White House.
Right. So I think the question of re-identification is one question, and the question of characterization is another question, and that they were treated together. And the reason I think they were treated together, so this is why it's so important to me that Locke bases his relational view of identity on these practical considerations, because I think that it's Locke who says, well, a person is someone, I mean, he doesn't put it this way, but once you see it, a person is someone for whom these characterization issues arise in a particular way. That's part of what it is to be a person. That's part of what it is for a person to be a forensic term, right? To be the kind of being about whom we can ask these questions. And so, and then he uses that to come up with a metaphysical criterion, at least a Lockean metaphysical criterion, right, of identity. And so the two became connected. The sort of what we care about is supposed to be explained by the relation that defines identity. So in the modern era where people have, well, I mean, not modern, like the early modern, but the contemporary era where people like Parfit and Shoemaker and Perry and so on are writing on personal identity, there's this sort of presumption that the definition of identity has to be in psychological terms, because Locke has shown us that, right, a biological account of identity isn't going to get at this aspect of personhood.
Yeah, and that's part of what's so jarring about animalism, that you lose that all of a sudden. Like,
Yep.
and Olson, who is its most vocal proponent, makes great play of saying, I don't care about those issues. And it's like, you can't not care about those issues. Those are the issues.
Well, he cares about them. He just doesn't think they have anything to do with the metaphysics of identity.
Right. No, he does actually say, I don't find that an interesting question. It's like, he's a true philosophy nerd. I only care about, parts of animals or real, true Aristotelian, notions.
Well, so, I mean, so it's interesting because, yeah, so in the first book, what I say is, look, the problem in, a lot of where we've gotten stuck in personal identity is that we're looking for something with the form of a re-identification, an answer to the re-identification question. So we're looking for a criterion of numerical identity over time to tell us that, the person slice at time t2 is identical to the person slice at time t1. But whatever
this is why
that
people don't read philosophy, is because they come across statements like that.
Exactly. Well, it's, you got to know stuff like that.
Yeah.
So, right, but then whatever it is supposed to answer these questions about should we hold the person responsible, should the person at time t1 be reassured by the fact that the person at time t2 is going to be there after the cataclysmic, natural disaster or war or whatever. And so basically what I say is the stuff we care about really has the form, at least in the first book, I say this, has the form of the characterization question. I want to know, am I still going to have experiences in the future? Which is a different question, really, from the question of, will there be someone in the future identical to me who will have experiences? Or at least so I argue.
Yeah, you sort of get this untangling in the famous Bernard Williams Macropolis case discussion, because he says, one of the things you can't have both in heaven. You can't have either it'll cease to be me, or it will be something that will be unappealing. Because, if it is me, I'll be bored. And if I'm not bored, it isn't me, Because I lived in Arkansas at one point, and there was a lot of religious channels on TV, on basic cable. And I remember this, it stuck in my head vividly. A preacher was saying, if you like the quiet, well, too bad, because in heaven there's going to be 10,000 people shouting hallelujah for every second of every day. And it's like, wow, this is really sinking home, but there goes my last incentive to be good, because that sure sounds like hell to me. And if I like, but of course you can say, no, no, no. Once you get there, you'll enjoy that. In which case, well, I don't want to be that person. I don't recognize that person. I don't identify with that person. I don't care if that person is there. So, okay.
So,